Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, and he will be lecturing today on monopoly and competition. Tom?
You shouldn't applaud before you hear what I have to say. You might not like it. That's got things backwards. Monopoly and competition. Well, it sounds like a pretty simple topic. Almost all of you have taken a course in microeconomics, or at least read something about microeconomics and think you know something about it. But what I'm going to do partly is talk about the historical evolution of the idea of competition and monopoly in a context of the role the Austrian school has played. And I wrote up just a simple definition of how Austrians think of competition. And this is a good short definition of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous, entrepreneurial discovery process. And that's a short sentence, but I think it really says it all about how Austrians have always thought of competition. It's dynamic, meaning it's ongoing, never-ending, it's evolutionary. It's rivalrous. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means competition includes price cutting, differentiating of products, mergers, the spinning off of firms that were once merged, and it turns out that the merger didn't work out, didn't cut costs and make more money after all. That's a part of the competitive process, and it's entrepreneurial. And you've heard from Peter Klein already about entrepreneurship. And so, of course, Austrians study entrepreneurship. Unlike the mainstream of the economics profession, that usually says almost nothing about it. If you look at the microeconomics books and you look up entrepreneur or entrepreneurship in the index, there's usually a paragraph or two, or maybe a picture of somebody, of Bill Gates or somebody like that, and that's about it. There's no real serious studying about it, and it's a discovery process. And what is meant by this is that the market is a process by which firms discover what works and what doesn't, what consumers like and what they don't like. It's how consumers discover what they like, what products will make their lives better, what are the best deals for them. And that's an important part of this definition, because it says that there's no expert, there's no central planner, there's no economist who can tell us what's efficient for us. We discover these things. We discover these things in the marketplace. For example, there's no way for an economist or anybody to tell us what the optimal or efficient organization of an industry is, what the size of an industry, in terms of economies of scale or anything like that. The market tells us that. No one can outguess the market. The market gives us this information. And so that's just a short definition of how the Austrians think of competition as an ongoing process. And this way of thinking started at least with Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. That's how Adam Smith thought of competition. And that lasted for quite a long time, the way of thinking about competition. And I think I'll start giving you an example of, there's an article that I wrote many years ago, co-authored with Jack High, and it was published in a journal called Economic Inquiry. And we were interested in what the economics profession had to say about the subject of competition and antitrust regulation or anti-monopoly regulation. At the time, the first U.S. government federal antitrust law was enacted. This was the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. And so we wanted to know, well, what were professional economists saying at the time about these antitrust laws, and how did their view of competition form their opinions of the anti-monopoly law, this new anti-monopoly law. And what we found was that, one, we were able to survey the entire American economics profession, every single person who had a job as an economist, and it was really only like a couple of dozen people. There weren't that many, nowadays it's much larger, but there was even an old article published in the American Economic Review in 1960, I think it was called the American Economics Club, something like that, by an author named Coates, C-O-A-T-S, and he wrote about this. It was like a very small club, the Americans who had really degrees in economics and had earned a living as an economist. So we were able to survey the entire population of the economics profession, and we found that every one of them was opposed to the whole idea of antitrust regulation as a matter of principle. They thought it was inherently incompatible with competition as they understood it, inherently. It wasn't just that the way it had been implemented was bad and could be improved upon. They thought it was inherently a bad idea and it could never be consistent with competition. I'll give you just a few examples. The co-founder of the American Economic Association, Richard T. Ely, who himself was a famous statist. He was a progressive. If you've ever read any of Murray Rothbard's writings on the progressives and their role in World War I, he says a lot of uncomplimentary things about Richard T. Ely in there. But Ely was the co-founder of the American Economic Association. And by the way, the founding statement of the American Economic Association, this was, I think it was 1885, the year 1885, said that capitalism or laissez-faire is unsound in morals and unsafe in practice. That was the founding statement of the American Economic Association. And people criticized von Mises as being an extremist because he never joined that organization. What an extremist he was. And so anyway, even Richard T. Ely said this about, it was the late 19th century, and what is happening is technology is changing. There are, for the first time ever, there are large industries with economies of scale, producing steel and cement and steel rails and all sorts of products with the costs going down and down and down and prices going down and down and down. And there are mergers. Corporate mergers was another route to becoming larger and achieving economies of scale, lower cost per unit of production. And this was going on in the U.S. In the 1880s. And when this was founded, when the AEA was founded. And here's what Ely said. He said, large-scale production is a thing which by no means necessarily signifies monopolized production. The other co-founder was John Bates Clark, whose name is up here on the wall somewhere. And he wrote in 1888 that the notion that industrial combinations would destroy competition should not be too hastily accepted. And that was sort of the mildest view we found. One of the founders of the University of Chicago economics program was a man named Herbert Davenport. And he said that only a few firms in an industry where there are economies of scale does not require the elimination of competition. Another sort of co-founder of the Chicago School, James Laughlin, said that even when a combination, merged companies, is large, a rival combination may give the most spirited competition. And the same things were said by Irving Fisher, Edwin R.A. Seligman, who was another famous early 20th century economist, and on and on. And so we document all this from Yale to Princeton, the University of Chicago, all the major universities where economists were at the time. They all said the same thing. And the reason for this was that they viewed competition like the Austrians do. They viewed competition like Adam Smith did. A dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship. So when they looked out there and they saw all these mergers happening, they saw economies of scale developing in steel and cement and other major industries, they weren't alarmed by it. They didn't think, as Karl Marx predicted, that there would be one giant corporation ruling over the entire planet. That was what Marx eventually said, that there would be merger after merger after merger, until finally there was only one corporation. That's the Marxian view. They thought that was crazy, that sort of thing. The competition doesn't work like that. And so they're basically Austrians. This all changed eventually. This all changed beginning around the 1920s or 30s, and the idea of competition changed. And so rather than this definition of competition essentially carrying the day, we had the definition of competition that you've all been exposed to if you've ever taken a course in microeconomics, and it was an equilibrium definition. You see, this is a dynamic process. The Austrian view, disequilibrium is more the normal state of affairs in the world. but it wasn't too susceptible to mathematical modeling. And so with the advent of the mathematization of the economics profession, the profession apparently thought it would be more scientific looking to have a different theory of competition, and that's when the so-called theory of perfect competition was invented. And so what does competition mean under that theory as of the 1930s? Well, you've seen all these assumptions, such as homogeneous products, many firms, perfect information. I'll call it info. There are different combinations of these, free entry, and homogeneous prices also. Different textbooks might have a few different things, but those are, you've all seen some of these things, homogeneous products and prices. And so this was developed as the benchmark of competition in an equilibrium situation. Not only are prices homogeneous, everyone charges the same thing, but they're all equal to marginal cost. And so for years and years and years, the government regulators have gone on witch hunts trying to find a divergence between price and marginal cost that lasts more than a short time. And if it does, then you may be the target of an antitrust lawsuit, your company. And it got to the extent that General Motors, for several decades, instructed its management to never ever get more than a 45% market share, because they thought even if they got it by having the best cars and the cheapest cars, that would be bad, because they would probably be sued by the federal government for violating the antitrust laws because they had too much of a market share. And of course, if people like their cars a lot, well, you might see long periods of time where they're able to charge a price above marginal cost. But that was the theory. And so this became the new benchmark, and it became this equilibrium condition, that in equilibrium, this is supposed to be true. Not always, but in equilibrium. And Hayek addressed this. As far as reading goes on this, if you want to introduce yourself to the Austrian view of competition, there's one essay that Hayek wrote entitled "The Meaning of Competition," and it's in his little book, Individualism and Economic Order, which is for sale downstairs, and it's one of the essays. And it's a good book to buy if you want to know the Hayekian view of the world. That's the book to buy first, I would think, because it has this famous essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, in there, and that's what Hayek is most known for, is the so-called knowledge problem, and this view of competition here, the meaning of competition. And also Israel Kirzner's book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, is a classic in the Austrian worldview. And also Murray Rothbard's chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State is a great technical exposition of the Austrian view of competition. And so, Hayek's commentary in the meaning of competition is an analysis of this new theory, new as of the 1930s. And I'll just read you one paragraph, or a couple of paragraphs of what he says about this. He says this, quote, "This theory throughout assumes that state of affairs already to exist, which, according to the truer view of the older theory, the process of competition tends to bring about. And that if the state of affairs assumed by the theory of perfect competition ever existed, it would not only deprive of their scope all the activities which the verb to compete describes, but would make them virtually impossible." So in other words, under perfect competition, there is no competition. It's all done with. It's all in equilibrium. And the second little passage I'll read to you from Hayek, he says, quote, "How many of the devices adopted in ordinary life to that end would still be open to a seller in a market in which so-called perfect competition prevails? I believe that the answer is exactly none. Advertising, price undercutting, and improving or differentiating the goods and services produced are all excluded by definition. Perfect competition means indeed the absence of all competitive activities," end quote. And so beginning around the 1930s, the economics profession adopted a view of competition that ruled out competition, essentially. And I'll give you an example from the horse's mouth, Paul Samuelson, here. I don't know, you probably only the front row can read this, but don't worry about it. I'll read it for you. This is a page from Paul Samuelson's famous textbook, the 1958 edition that I pulled off the shelf over here. I Xeroxed it just so you don't think I'm just making this all up, so you can actually see it's right. You can go find it yourself, the 1958 edition. Samuelson's book was first published in 1948, and it was the biggest selling economics textbook in the world for 40 years after that. And so to the extent that people learned something about competition and the way economists think about competition, this was overwhelmingly the book. And this is a chapter where he talks about this, where he says, a perfect competitor is one who can sell all he wishes at the going market price. But is unable in any appreciable degree to raise or depress the market price. And by definition, a perfectly competitive industry is one made up exclusively of numerous perfect competitors. In all likelihood, it has some kind of organized auction mechanism there. And so then he goes on to say, well, how does this fit with the real world? How competitive is the real world? And he says, notice how strict this definition is. Well, yeah, it is. It rules out all competition, all real competition. And then he says, did you ever hear of an auction market for razor blades or toothpaste or cigarettes? And so he's saying, well, no, there's no like auction barn for razor blades, and therefore it's not competitive. It's monopolistic. It must be by definition. And he goes on to produce a list of all sorts of products, razor blades, toothpaste, cotton, natural gas, all these things, wheat. And then he goes down to the list and he says, well, when you go down the list, quote, I'm quoting, you'll find that only potatoes, tobacco, wheat, and cotton come within our strict definition of perfect competition. And so in the American economy, you as a consumer, you're safe if you're eating potatoes, smoking cigars, eating bread, and wearing cotton blue jeans. But otherwise, you're the victim of monopoly, is sort of the thing that he's saying. And he even gets this wrong. Even this is wrong, because at the time he wrote this, the agricultural industries like potatoes, tobacco, wheat were all cartelized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture with all of its programs paying farmers for not growing tobacco and acreage allotments that were started during the Great Depression and things like that. And so these were actually monopolistic industries. They're all protected by tariffs. And so in other words, Samuelson totally misled generations of students in terms of the definition of monopoly. And what this is, it's an example of what I think it was Harold Demsetz who coined the phrase nirvana fallacy. This has nothing to do with that heavy metal band. The nirvana fallacy. The economist Harold Demsetz wrote an article in the Journal of Law and Economics way back around 1969, around there, about this phenomenon of the nirvana fallacy. And what it is basically is that the practice by economists of taking this model, the competitive model, and saying, well, this is perfection. A perfect world, many firms, free entry, and so forth, and then comparing it to the real world, like Samuelson just did, and saying, aha, the real world is not perfect, the markets fail. And of course, the reason why it's a fallacy is because, if you compare anything to utopian perfection, anything is going to fail, of course. And so that's why I've always thought that the whole study of competition by the mainstream of the economics profession is fraudulent. So the nirvana fallacy is just a gross fraud to engage in this type of behavior. And especially when you look at yourself as a policy advisor, advising governments to prosecute companies because they're not perfect, under this theory, and that went on for many, many years. And so, if you look at some of these assumptions, of course, homogeneous products, this is not taken as seriously anymore. But remember, I'm talking about this historically as well as just for present day relevance. And so Well, what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that was that once this model was developed, and homogeneous products were said to be one of the benchmarks of competition, then the theories of monopolistic competition were developed by Joan Robinson and Edward Chamberlain. And some of you are familiar with this. And so monopolistic competition means that, you have many firms, so that assumption holds, but they all differentiate their products, don't they? And so no two products are exactly alike. Even if they are physically alike, they could be perceived as being different by advertising. So the image of a product, even if the exact same black tire for your car, the image might be different, and that's a differentiation. And so the theory went, when you think about it, just about everything in the world is monopolistic because it's all different in the eyes of the consumers, either physically or mentally. It's different, and so and I've read a lot of the articles in the economics literature from this time when this was all being developed, and it's very easy to get the impression of a lot of the writers that they were gleeful about this, that they had been sitting there for years just upset about the fact that they didn't have a weapon with which to beat on capitalism. And here it was. They finally found it. And Joan Robinson and Edward Chamberlain were British statists. And so they developed this whole apparatus of monopolistic competition. And as a result, even the British government took this very seriously, and they actually tried to force homogeneity in housing and in some other industries in the world. And what this also led to was eventually in the economics profession was suspicion of innovation as being antisocial or monopolistic. And the way in which this came about was, if you look at this is the standard mainstream textbook monopoly diagram here. And the Nirvana fallacy was put into play here. And this is a standard monopoly diagram with a downward sloping demand curve. Here's marginal revenue in a constant cost industry with marginal cost and average cost being horizontal. And here's the monopoly price, PM. And what does the monopoly do according to the standard model? Well, they produce this level of output. That's the profit maximizing level of output, which is less than would be produced in this industry if there was competition. If there was competition, then marginal cost, this would be the sum of the marginal cost curves of all the firms or the supply curve. And so this would be the equilibrium here if there were competition. And so the story goes, what do monopolies do? They restrict output. That's a bad thing because there's a deadweight loss. There's a loss of consumer surplus there. And so how this was applied to the homogeneous product assumption is that if there's an innovation, the creation of a new product, for a while you're a monopoly. You're the sole seller. By definition, you're the sole seller of that product. And so you're restricting output. And so there were all sorts of recommendations, and some of them went through by the government to force innovators to share their secrets with the competition. In fact, if any of you paid any attention several years ago to the Microsoft antitrust case, that's exactly what the government wanted to try to force Microsoft to do, to give away its source code, to put it online so that anybody could have it for Windows. Just as it'd be like forcing Coca-Cola to publish the recipe for Coca-Cola on the internet. No one has been able to figure it out all these years. But these sorts of things were actually proposed for a long, long time. And like I said, that was exactly what the government was trying to do with Microsoft, force them to give away their trade secrets in the name of efficiency, in the name of competition. And why this is a Nirvana fallacy is that the way to look at this is, here we are without the innovation that created the new product. It's zero. So at zero, there's no consumer surplus at all because this product doesn't exist. No one benefits from it. The inventor invents the product. The entrepreneur invents the product, creates a product, puts it on the market. And it sells this quantity, QM. So there's all this consumer surplus here that is benefiting consumers. And so that's the real comparison. The real comparison is from zero, which is where you were, to the amount of trade that exists that benefits buyers and sellers. Okay, but the nirvana fallacy is to say, well, let's compare the actual level of output, Q, to the level of output that would exist if everybody in the world simultaneously had the idea of the inventor and put 10,000 replicas of it on the market, perfect competition. And of course, that's that comparing the real world to utopia again. So that's why it's called a fallacy. Innovation and R&D are good things by this view. And so this kind of nonsense went on in government circles for a long time, trying to crack down on innovation. There was an economist named Dennis Mueller, who's used to be a very big name in the field of industrial organization. He actually wrote a paper in the Economic Journal, the British academic journal, recommending that the U.S. Congress create a new committee to determine which types of R&D should be permitted in the private sector and which should not, because he thought he would be able to tell which type would lead to monopoly and which would not lead to monopoly. And of course, if that were to happen, this crowd probably could guess pretty easily what would happen is that companies would lobby Congress to prohibit their competitors' R&D and to allow their R&D. And that was what would create monopoly power. That would create monopoly power. So anyway, that's one reason a couple of reasons why that's a bad idea. And this is again, probably nobody can read that. It's too light in here. But I'm just putting this up again so that you know I'm not making these numbers up. This is the annual report from the Dallas Fed, 1998. And they did there's an economist at the Dallas Fed named Michael Cox, who's a pretty good free market economist. And I like to think that he must be a spy for us. He works at the Fed, but he's done some really interesting research over the years. The Fed publishes it, and then he's published a couple books out of it. And this was the annual report, and what it was about is mass customization, the integration of mass production in manufacturing with computers, with the computer revolution, the high-tech revolution, and how it's now possible in today's world, and as of 1998, to make money in a lot of products, for companies to be very profitable, producing relatively low volume of products for niche markets, whereas in the old days, 50 years ago, the way to make money in manufacturing was produce a zillion replicas of the exact same thing and get economies of scale in your factory and low cost, and that's how you make a lot of money in manufacturing. But the integration of technology, computer technology in manufacturing has made it this all a different world. And in other words, there's been an explosion in product differentiation because of this. Any of you, I don't know, maybe some of you have bought a car online. If I wanted to buy a car after this class, I could just go online, pick the car I want. I could pick all the add-ons that I want. Just click here. Then I could finance it online, put it online, and it'd take me about 15 minutes, and the factory will make it for me and deliver in a week or two. That was just unthinkable 30 or 40 years ago, but that's what this is about. And so what they did is, in some of these tables, it's just, vehicle models in the early 70s compared to the late 90s, 140 versus 260, magazine titles, 339 versus 790, even books, 40,000 versus 77,000, even Pop-Tarts. There were only 3 brands of Pop-Tarts in the early 70s. Could you imagine that? The sin, one of the sins of capitalism. And then 29, thankfully by the late 1990s, there were 29. Mouthwashes, 15 to 66. And they have numerous tables that show this. This is all outdated. I think beer is in this one. Yeah, only 25 brands of beer in the 1980 versus 187 by 1998. It's probably 1,877 by now, or more than that. And so what this is about is this mass proliferation of product variety. And why is this happening? Well, it's happening because of competition. It's not happening because the world is becoming monopolistic. And I think this is one of the things that has softened the critiques of homogeneous, unhomogeneous products. And I don't think it's really ridiculous to see a Dennis Mueller today, or someone like him, writing an article in the Economics Journal calling for government regulation of product variety. Although you do see sociologists, and I had my university hires a number of left-wing lawyers to teach businesses how to be socially responsible. And one of their speakers that they brought into the campus a year or two ago just stood up there for 45 minutes and whined and moaned about how there are too many items on menus at restaurants. And that's one of the failures of capitalism is there's too much stuff on it. We waste too much time trying to decide what food to order at restaurants or what cars to buy. And so this is all bad. This is all bad. It needs to be regulated and be made socially responsible. But like I said, those are lawyers. And so we expect that kind of idiocy from lawyers who talk about economic subjects and try to justify their existence somehow at universities. But for an economist to say this in this day and age is truly ridiculous as far as that goes. And so that's homogeneous products. Now, the many firms assumption of the model, that caused endless mischief because that meant the competition, or monopoly rather. The definition of monopoly historically meant government-created monopoly. It always meant that. The whole common law developed in Britain for decades and decades, generations treated monopoly as a grant from the government. And that's how it was always thought of until around the late 19th, early 20th century. All of a sudden, bigness became a definition of monopoly. And then with the incorporation of this model, the perfect competition model, that enshrined the idea that the number of firms is a measuring rod of competition. Remember the quotes I gave you from Richard T. Ely and John Bates Clark in the late 1800s, early 20th century. They didn't see any problem with the fact that there were fewer firms today in some industries than there were 5 years ago. Because what did they see? Well, they saw costs going down and prices to consumers going down as a result. So what's the problem? It's competition, as they saw it. It's evolutionary. That all changed, of course. And so this assumption of many firms was enshrined in the literature of economics in something called the market concentration doctrine. And the market concentration doctrine made a simple assumption. The assumption was that fewer firms makes it easier for collusion to happen and for cartels to form. Therefore, fewer firms leads to monopoly. And so the government adopted all these measuring sticks of monopoly, such as a 4-firm concentration ratio, 8-firm concentration ratio, and these were defined as the percentage of sales made by the 4 largest firms, for example. That would be a 4-firm concentration ratio. There was Abba Lerner, the socialist who debated Mises on the socialist calculation debate. He came up with an index, the Lerner index, which purported to measure the extent to which price diverged from marginal cost. And that's another index that the government uses sometimes and has used to try to go on its hunts for monopoly, which are really hunts for deviations from nirvana, from perfect competition. And so this was the heart and soul of antitrust regulation for many, many years, this measuring rod of many firms good, fewer firms bad. That's about the level of scientific discussion at the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. And this held sway in policy circles from roughly the 1940s until the 1980s. But there was a bit of a revolution in economics. And the way the revolution took place is that there were some people at the Chicago School who rediscovered the Austrian view of competition. Of course, they never gave the Austrians any credit for it. They never called themselves Austrians. They never quoted the Austrians. But every bit of it was thoroughly Austrian in that it looked at competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process and said, wait a minute, these antitrust policies are actually bad. They're actually harming competition. And they even gave it a name. The Chicago schoolers gave this a name called the New Learning. And although it wasn't, it was the old learning. It was the rediscovery of the old Austrian view of competition. But since they were competing for prestige within the economics profession, they couldn't give credit to where it was really due. They just had to say, well, this is our idea, which it really wasn't. It's Adam Smith's idea, really. And so I brought one more table of numbers. I'm going to put it up, and you need to memorize all these numbers because it's going to be the first question on the exam at the end of the week. And whoever doesn't get them all right cannot go on to the oral exam. Okay, that's it. But again, I guess the front row can maybe read this, but I'll put this up so that you know I'm not making numbers up. This is from a book, and this is one example I'm going to give of this revolution I'm talking about, where the economics profession came around to the Austrian view of competition by looking at it as a more dynamic, rivalrous process rather than as an end state or an equilibrium state. And this is a book by Yale Brozen, B-R-O-Z-E-N. His first name is Yale, just like Yale University. And the title of the book is Concentration, Mergers, and Public Policy. It was written in the, I think, 1983, around there. And it was a summary of this Chicago school research, mostly his, up to that point. And this is an example of the type of thing that really turned the economics profession around and turned public policy around for years. It's gone back downhill now, but it really was effective. And so what this is there were all these studies, mostly coming out of Harvard, and Harvard economists, saying that industrial concentration, that is industries where there are fewer firms with a high market share, leads to monopoly. And so they did all these statistical tests finding correlations between industrial concentration on the one hand and the high profits on the other hand, higher than normal profits. And they assumed that the correlation was causation, under the theory that industrial concentration makes the formation of cartels easier, therefore the cause of the higher profitability is monopoly. Well, what does your common understanding of competition say? Well, it says, well, if there's above average profits being earned in one industry, entry will occur. People from all over the world will start competing for those profits, and that will eventually drive down the level of profits, competition. That's what competition does if you look at it over time, okay, dynamic, as I said. But if you take a snapshot, of course, at any one time, it's true that somebody's going to be the best. Somebody's going to have a big market share in just about every industry, bigger than everybody else, and above average profitability. So if you take a snapshot or equilibrium view, yeah, you'll always find somebody's the best. The New Orleans Saints are the best in the NFL as of now. They won the Super Bowl. Okay, but over time, you think the Saints are a pretty crappy team. If you look at their fans used to put paper bags over their heads, literally. They call them the Aints. For years and years, they call them the Aints. And so, yeah, if you look at just the year 2009, wow, that's the greatest team. Who could ever beat the Saints? No one will ever beat the Saints. Let's send the Federal Trade Commission in there to New Orleans. Do something about this. And that's basically what Brozen did with American manufacturing. He took all the same industries that the Harvard economists were looking at at a snapshot, at a point in time, and saying, aha, there's monopoly here. Look at this. They're making above average profits. And I'll read a few of these that show you what he's doing here. Like, as I said, only the people in the front row can see this probably. But what he has here is percentage return on book net worth on two peaks of the business cycle, 1948 and 1956. So he didn't want to have one set of data for a recession and then another for a boom. He wanted to try to control the best he could for general economic conditions. And so the first one he has listed is lumber, percentage return on net worth, 29.3 down to 12.6. And then he ranks them. So lumber in that year happened to be the number one profitable industry. That's because of the post-war housing boom, I assume. And so, but by 1956, lumber went from first to 20th, and then appliances, the housing boom, appliances, washing machines, and so forth, went from the second most profitable to 25th, and then textiles went from 3rd to 39th. You had automobiles went from 4th to 12, and so forth. And this is true in all these two tables of statistics. What generally happened during this relatively short period of time is that the most profitable industries, their profit rates descended toward the median, and the less profitable industries ascended. They moved up. They ascended toward the medium. And you can see this, and he does it in the book also for different time periods, not just 1948 and 56, and he goes up to the 1970s later on in the book. And so manufacturing, which had been condemned as is hopelessly monopolistic. Between all the product differentiation and all the mergers, my God, it's a monopolistic monster. Is what we learned from Paul Samuelson at MIT and the Harvard economists who did all these concentration studies. But this was like a big stink bomb right in Harvard Yard. This article from this book, because it really, I used to teach industrial organization at the PhD level at George Mason, and in the days when a lot of this was happening, and I read all of this literature, and they were in a panic. It was kind of fun to read some of these articles. They were desperate to defend their human capital, but people like Harold Demsetz and Yale Brosen just keep coming at them. And then Dom Armentano, who's an Austrian, published his book, Antitrust and Monopoly, where he demonstrated that the top 55 federal antitrust cases in American history up to that point, early 80s, in every single case, companies were cutting costs, cutting prices, creating new products, innovating, expanding output, doing all the opposite things of what the standard theory says monopolists do. Every single one, all 55. Armentano shows that in this book, which I think there's an abridged version of it for sale downstairs. And so that's one of the things that Brosen did. And that it really did turn things around, but the key to it was looking at competition dynamic over time. If you take just this snapshot view, well, of course, you're going to get that view. And here's another thing that happened. I'll put this monopoly diagram back on. The economics profession started trying to measure the cost of monopoly, the social cost of monopoly. There's a big literature on that. And basically, much of it started out trying to get statistical estimates of this triangle right here. This is called the welfare triangle in the monopoly model. It's the loss of consumer surplus due to the output restriction from here, Q competition to Q monopoly. And so I think the very first article was published by Arnold Harberger in the American Economic Review in 1954, and he came up with 0.1% of GDP. And so the big red panic button at Harvard University at the economics department was pushed because they had spent careers developing market failure models of monopolistic competition in every conceivable way in which markets deviate from nirvana or utopia. And here comes Arnold Harberger at the University of Chicago saying, well, yeah, even if we believe all these models of how awful industry is, it's only 0.1% of GDP, and that's probably not even the amount of time economists spend studying monopoly. What's the problem? And so panic, had to set in, and so and they kept getting more and more papers published like this, and the estimates went up to maybe 5 or 6% or something like that. But as is true with all econometric work, it's endless. It's just endless. It creates careers for economists, but it rarely ever settles much of anything. It's just endless debates over omitted variables and all the hundreds of things you can argue over in economics journals and make a career out of it without ever learning anything or teaching anybody anything. It reminds me of my colleague who was so excited, biggest day of his life. He had an article accepted in the Journal of Finance, which if you're in the area of corporate finance in academia, that's the big journal. And I asked him, well, what will we know about finance now that we did not know before your paper was published? He said, nothing. He said, nothing. I just tweaked an econometric technique that somebody else had developed and showed that it could be tweaked. But it really says nothing about finance per se, and so that's how a lot of the careers are made in the field of economics and finance. But this whole technique, this all assumes equilibrium. This is an equilibrium model, and so what these people did is they used data gathered by the U.S. Commerce Department. That's who gathers data on these industries. They always use Commerce Department data. That means that they assume that on the day the Commerce Department bureaucrat made a phone call to IBM or whoever and asked them, what are you charging for your computers today? They assumed that everything was in long-run equilibrium, okay? And so they get all this data. The assumption is that all these prices and all this cost data is long-run equilibrium costs and long-run equilibrium prices, and none of these markets are in disequilibrium. It has to be the assumption if you apply that data to this model to measure this. And so anyway, an economist who's an Austrian, Steve Littlechild, a British economist, he published an article in the Economics Journal where he took a close look at the original Harburger article. And I'd read this in graduate school, but I didn't catch this one passage from it, I guess. At least when I went to graduate school, they gave us an overwhelming reading list. It was like humanly impossible for anybody to read all this stuff at one time. And so you had to try to economize. And this must have been one of the areas where I economized, didn't read this particular passage. But Harburger admitted in this paper, as did others in this literature, that he's trying to measure monopoly profits in his thing. He assumed, he wrote right in the article, that we have no way of knowing whether these profits we're trying to measure are equilibrium profits or disequilibrium profits. But we're going to assume that they're all equilibrium profits. And so, of course, disequilibrium profits could just be, well, a product comes on the market and it's very popular, it catches on, everybody wants it. There's no monopoly there, but everybody wants it. It's a popular new product. And then competition eventually comes in and the price goes down and the profits go down. But they were saying, no, we're assuming that any profits we see that are above normal are equilibrium monopoly profits. That way we can increase the estimate of our deadweight loss of monopoly and so forth, and profits of monopoly. And other authors did that too. Steve Littlechild quoted Dennis Mueller again and Keith Cowling, who wrote another article in the Economic Journal saying the same thing. So it's just, I wouldn't call it dishonest because they admitted that what they were doing. They didn't hide this. They said, we admit that we don't know what the hell we're talking about. And so they were very honest about it. They did say that. We don't know we haven't the clue whether this is equilibrium or disequilibrium. And so all these studies are pretty much worthless. Although they did make many careers, like my friend in the Finance Journal, big long resumes from all these guys who wrote these. Homogeneous prices, that assumption. Well, there are a lot of reasons why firms don't all charge the same prices for things. Example I sometimes give in a class would be when I lived in downtown Baltimore for a while. I lived in a townhouse. And advertisers, local businesses would hire these guys. They're like SWAT teams. A van would pull up in front of your house, and 3 or 4 guys would jump out the back, and they're carrying paper sacks with advertising flyers for pizza joints. And they would go door to door and put all the flyers in your mailbox. So I'd get home at night, and there'd be a giant pile of paper in front of my door with advertising things like, the newest pizza joint in town is now open. Come and get a large pizza, a 32-ounce Coke, and a sub sandwich for $5.99 or something ridiculous like that. And so, and they would do that for the first couple of weeks just to get people in the door. Because how do you compete when you're new in a business like that? You have to get people to come and try out your pizza. Well, how do you do that? Well, you offer them a good deal. That's how you do that. You don't just put a sign up and say, boy, my pizza is much better than that guy down there. Well, who says? Give them an incentive. And so that's typically what would happen. So there are a lot of reasons why you see different prices charged all the time. But according to the standard model, though, this is the monopoly model. If price is ever above marginal cost, that's a no-no. That's hit the alarm button. That's a potential monopoly. Okay. Well, maybe I'll leave that for now. And in terms of the real source of a monopoly has always been government, as I said, and even this output restriction idea, Rothbard is sort of entertaining as always when he talks about it in his chapter in Man, Economy, and State. When you look at the output restriction idea, one serious, he's not totally entertaining, but one really good point he makes is that, okay, they're saying welfare is reduced by output restriction. Well, if this industry is using fewer resources than it otherwise would because of this output restriction, those resources are being put to work somewhere else. They'll be bid away by other entrepreneurs, the labor and the materials and so forth, to do other things. So this means that by definition, there'll be an expansion of output somewhere else, even though there's a reduction of output here. And so how could you say unequivocally there's a reduction in welfare if there's an expansion somewhere else? He just takes it. And then there's sort of a reductio ad absurdum to all this. How many of you watched Ultimate Fighting on TV? Some of the guys are probably fans. Any women fans of Ultimate Fighting? How about Ultimate Mud Wrestling? Anybody? Do they have that? That would be a good one. Maybe we should. It's an entrepreneurial idea. But you know, the Ultimate Fighting guys, they just beat each other's brains in. If you ever watched it, it's much more vicious than the Muhammad Ali, Frazier type of boxing. These guys really, you know, break each other's arms, literally, and legs, things like that. And how often do these guys fight, do you think? Who watches? Who's a fan? We got a fan here. Who wants to take a guess? How often do they do this? It's pretty brutal.
How often per year?
Yeah, about
2 or 3 times if you're
yeah. You have to be in top condition. You have to be as strong as you can get, because it's a really grueling thing if you ever watch it. So 2 or 3 times a year. Well, they're obviously restricting output, aren't they? 2 or 3 times a year. Why don't they fight like Brad Pitt did in that movie Fight Club? Every night they were down there, bare knuckles too, fighting. And you know, that was a perfectly competitive fight club there every single night. And so you could, if you look at this whole idea of output restriction as a measuring rod of monopoly, it can get really ridiculous. And the policymakers have made it ridiculous. An example, I probably will never forget this, because it was just such a caricature of the lunacy of this idea. There was a guy from the Federal Trade Commission giving a talk at a conference in DC on antitrust. And he was bragging about all the wonderful things they were doing. And he said in Detroit, the automobile dealers were shutting down at 5 p.m. in the wintertime in Detroit, all of them. So if you wanted to buy a car after work in the city of Detroit, and this was 20 years ago, you couldn't. And he said the FTC was investigating this because they thought they were colluding to restrict output by closing down at 5 o'clock in the wintertime. And so I asked him, I was the one that I stood up and asked him, does this mean that forced labor is a prerequisite for economic efficiency? Because that's really what you're saying. You know, what are they going to do? Tell these guys you have to stay at work until 9 o'clock? You know, that would be forced labor. That would be like slavery. You know, you want to. It's your business. You own it. You want to go home at 5 o'clock and have dinner. No, the government says you got to stay there till 9. What is that? That's conscription. And so he was just totally silent. He never thought of that before, but he was so self-congratulatory in his presentation. He not really thought about that. And so, but that's true. That would be true. It's a form of conscription if you look at it that way. And another point that Rothbard makes in his analysis of this is, most economists talk about consumer sovereignty and the loss of consumer welfare from the output restriction. But Rothbard says, well, he makes the case for individual sovereignty. And in other words, it's a property rights based approach, because, here's a business owner, private business owner, and he or she can do whatever they want with their property as long as they don't harm somebody with it. And so, who's to say that the well-being of the consumer should always take precedence over the well-being of the business owner, who's just doing with his own property, trying to make as much money as he can with his own property? Why is the consumer always the more important? And that's a good example of how a bias sneaks into economics under the guise of science, under the guise of positivism and unbiased work. But that is a bias. You are making a statement about what you think the appropriate system of property rights is. You're saying that the average consumer should have superior property rights to the average business owner in here, even though it's never made explicit by economists. Well, like I said, government has always been the source of monopoly, and I'm teaching an online course on the road to serfdom right now through the Mises Academy. And by the way, if anyone wants to lose weight, do what I did last night. Go up to Marty Rockwell's office and sit there for about an hour and a half at about 6 p.m. after the heat has come through the skylight all afternoon, right there. It's like a sauna up there. And so if you think it's cold in every other room in this whole building, it's freezing. And where I go to teach my class with the doors shut to keep the noise out, it must have been 120 degrees in there with the skylight, with the sun beating down. But anyway, here's Friedrich Hayek in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, talks about monopoly in a number of places. And he says this was published in 1944. Monopolists regularly seek and frequently obtain the assistance of the power of the state to make their control effective. Everybody knows that. He says the United States and Germany, he says the growth of cartels and syndicates has since 1878 been systematically fostered by deliberate policy. So he's talking about Germany and the United States, and he says, yes, there's been monopoly, but it's been deliberate policy. How has it been deliberate policy? Well, I can read to you how so-called natural monopolies were created in the utilities industry. Here's an example of how exactly natural monopolies came about. There was nothing natural about it. There was nothing free market about it. There were many competitors in the telephone industry, the electric power industry, natural gas, water supply. They never did monopolize. But there's a book and an article of mine called The Myth of Natural Monopoly. I cited a book called The Gaslight Company of Baltimore. And believe it or not, Richard T. Ely has a lot to do with this. Richard T. Ely was in Baltimore teaching at Johns Hopkins, and he wrote a whole bunch of articles on the electric power and in the light industry of his time. And a lot of this made it into this book that I dug up and explained how natural monopoly, so-called, came about. And here's how it came about. In 1890, a bill was introduced into the Maryland legislature which called for an annual payment to the city from the Consolidated Gas Company, it's now called Baltimore Gas and Electric, of $10,000 a year and 3% of all dividends declared in return for the privilege of enjoying a 25-year monopoly, end quote. And this is what happened all over America. Governments created 25 or 30-year monopolies by law, and of course, they allowed them to charge monopoly prices, and then they split the loot with the politicians. 3% of all profits, plus a $10,000 a year signing bonus for the politicians for signing the law into law. And that's how so-called natural monopoly, there's not the story that you were all miseducated in if you took microeconomics was that economies of scale were becoming prevalent and one big firm was dominating all these industries. Therefore, some politician, some local politician, the mayor or the governor, got on his big white horse and rode in and saved the consumer from monopoly. That's not how it happened. That's a myth. Even though you're taught that in your economics books, it's a myth. It never happened like that. This is how it happened. Other examples, a few more examples of the real source of monopoly in American history anyway. The railroad and trucking industries were monopolized for many, many years through the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the first head of it was the president of a railroad corporation. And guess what? They regulated prices at monopolistic levels for decades. The same with the Civil Aeronautics Board. There were more airlines in America in the 1930s than there were in the 1970s. The Civil Aeronautics Board was a regulatory agency that reduced the competition in airlines. And they literally made price competition illegal. The government set the prices for airfares. That's why they were eventually deregulated in the late 70s. One of the rare good things that happened in American economic history as far as deregulation goes. But the stories are legendary about how back in those days in the 50s, the main people who flew on the airlines were businessmen, mostly men. Very few women were. I've seen the statistics on this, like the business school graduates in 1970 versus 2010 or 2000, and it's like 3% versus 55%. So back in the 50s, there were very few women flying. And so it was illegal to compete by price. And so what the airlines did was they competed by quality. And the type of quality was free booze and flight attendants dressed like Playboy bunnies. It was like every airline was like Hooters Air. Every single one of them. And I looked this up on the web once, and there are whole books written about this with pictures of these women dressed like cheerleaders and things on, flight attendants. But that's how they competed. So even government can never totally eliminate competition. No matter how hard it tries, somebody will get around it. But they did this for many, many years. But that's how it goes. Antitrust. I'm kind of running out of time, but one of my articles that I published many years ago in the International Review of Law and Economics is one where I looked at the origins of the Sherman Act. Because I was an economics major in school, I got a PhD, I was teaching for a few years, and it struck me that I never saw evidence of this story that there was monopoly in the late 19th century to justify the Sherman Act. I'd seen it written over and over and over and over again, but where's the evidence? And so, and I found out that no one had ever done this. No one had ever sought published evidence anywhere. And so I just looked at the two most prevalent things that economists talk about. What was happening to production, output, and what was happening to prices in these industries that were accused of being monopolies in the decade prior to the Sherman Act, 1880 to 1890. And what I found was that in terms of output, GDP was expanding by, I think it was 7 or 8% during that decade, not 7 or 8, more than that, maybe like 3% a year for a decade. It's pretty good expansion. But these industries that were accused of being monopolies expanded their output by 175% during the decade prior to the Sherman Act. This was a period of price deflation. Prices went down on average by 7%. All of these industries for a decade were cutting their prices faster than the general economy. So these were the most rapidly expanding, dynamic, vigorously price-cutting industries for decades, and they were targeted as being monopolies, which they weren't. They were just fierce competitors. They were excellent competitors. John D. Rockefeller made his money by dropping the price of refined kerosene down to almost to nothing. That's how he made his money. That's how you make big money in manufacturing. Figure out how to sell large volumes to the masses, and that's what these entrepreneurs did. And so even the story of where the antitrust laws came from and why they were necessary, I argue is false. And I write about this in my book also, How Capitalism Saved America, which is for sale, and for an extra $10 you can get my autograph on that downstairs. And time is up.